Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of day you're actually listening to this. But my guest today is Dr. Hindi Mermelstein. Dr. Mermelstein is a board certified psychiatrist, and she's actually what we call a liaison psychiatrist, where a psychiatrist is embedded in a medical unit. And in this space, amongst other things, she is both a trailblazer and an expert in women's health issues. And she is one of those rare individuals who can traverse the from and non-from worlds with finesse and sensitivity. Our topic for today is Pikuach Nefesh, Pikuach Nefashot, saving lives, saving souls. How do you go from retreat to reentry? So let me ask you, Dr. Mermelstein, there's been a lot of talk about resilience and stamina, but you have always talked from the beginning of the pandemic about reentry. Can you tell us exactly what that is?
A year ago, or maybe a little bit over a year ago, we were told to put our lives on pause, essentially to put a pause button. The pandemic hit, the fear, the contagion of fear came, and the fear of contagion came simultaneously. And we retreated into our homes and developed a system whereby we had individuals without intimacy and families without connection, and institutions in the community really that the physical structures stayed, they felt sort of hollowed out. They were no longer able to serve their purpose. When it first started, it made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense because we did not want to get medical care did not want to get overwhelmed, and we ourselves were overwhelmed by all that was happening, by the uncertainty, by the unknowingness, by the changing information pool, all of that. But it's now been about 14 months, maybe a little around 14 months. And what was originally started as an acute process, in medicine, we talk about there is an acute and this chronic. In the acute system, we are allowed to go on pause because the world outside continues. And when we are slightly better, we begin to integrate, and we can take what's happened to us, integrate it into the world, and re-enter that world. The pandemic did not allow that. The way things were organized, we sort of stayed on acute and semi-acute all this time. And now that we are, thank God, in a different place in reality, the vaccination, information, knowledge, vaccinations have all allowed us to, in truth, treat COVID-19 differently. But we are still stuck in many ways on pause. Many of us do not know, are not comfortable in how resuming our lives. In fact, each one of us in this audience has a funny story about things that you would expect not to be an issue. I have a daughter who's a nurse, and she was living with us at the time the pandemic started. And she used to say to me, should I move out? And I'd say, don't be ridiculous, you live here. We'll figure out how to make this work. I'm in healthcare, she was in healthcare. But we did not touch each other, or we did not kiss each other for months and months. She was in the first group of vaccinations, and I was in the second group. So both of us, each one of us had been vaccinated now, thank God, doubly vaccinated since January. And yet I don't think I actually kissed her until about a month ago, because it had become we had gotten so used to being afraid and so used to being apart, even within a household, that trying to reconnect that way was difficult and felt awkward.
Right. Can you parse this out for us in reentry from the community perspective, reentry from the family perspective, and reentry, as you started to talk about now, from the personal perspective?
Reentry from the personal, I'm going to do it the other way around, if I may, because we build from individuals to families to tribes to communities. We don't build from communities backwards. Okay. All politics are local, and that was not a political comment. And we start with individual connections. So the individual is exactly what I was talking, exactly what I'm in. Within groups of people who've been living in the same, even in the same pod, many of us became separate within that pod. Individual women talked about how they had to now take their roles that were separate. Women worked very, very hard at having professional roles and personal roles. And during the pandemic, they found themselves in the same literal physical space and the same emotional space and the same cognitive space, and did not know how to share that. Did not know how to not spread themselves and how to share those roles. And yet, so we talked a lot about the people talked, but in terms of the connection, in terms of what happened when you went to the mikveh and came home. Going to the mikveh became such a complicated issue because of risk that was true and risk that was perceived and concern that was concern based on the unknown, really based on the unknown. That after all this time, people have not been able to automatically just pick up the pause button and resume that sense of safety. There was no reason medically that my daughter and I could not kiss each other, could not be close to each other. In truth, because she's not been working on a COVID unit, I'm not working on a COVID unit, we both mask everywhere, she's been fully vaccinated, I've been fully vaccinated. And yet we were so used to being afraid of being so intimate that we had to cognitively practice the safety of being connected again like that. So that's the individual. And what about families? One of the questions always becomes about, the number one question I get on one of the chats is just this question. My parents are doubly vaccinated and they have not seen my children for a year. But my children are not vaccinated, and my children are in school, and my children went to the playgrounds, and my children have friends down the block. Is it safe for them to come? Is it safe for them to be there? As people get older, families are used to being together, families support each other, they provide a structure on which to absorb all this distress and on which to base foundational comfort with moving forward in spite of risk. This group collective risk that gets assumed in families that now has been, that through the pandemic had been divided and had been exacerbated. So instead of being a source of comfort, support, and togetherness, it has become and remains in many cases a source of anxiety and uncertainty. And then we're going to look at the community, and the community has this both in spades. Community structures, literally. The shuls, the buildings are there, but they were empty. Funerals, all those activities, all those ritual activities on which we organize, on which we support, on which we're able to take our individual anxieties and share them, sort of like absorb them, share them, use them. All those things that provide both stability and structure for us, whether it's shuls or whether it's gyms or whether it's grocery stores, all our community, both personal, our community, both religious and social and cultural, our workplace, all those things had been put on pause as well. All those things still remained on paper or remained on Zoom or remained in some physical space, but did not serve and were not able to serve in that same way.
So I think this brings me to really the fundamental question of why we're actually speaking with each other and with you today. I'll share with you briefly a story of my own experience. Double vaccinated, as you know, I'm a physician specializing in virology and infectious disease. So needless to say, I know and have known from day one the science and the clinical of what's been happening and going on. But a short while after I knew that I would have protective antibody, because I actually know that, I went to FedEx to mail a package to one of my children who lives in California. I was the only person in this probably 2,000 square foot FedEx facility, but I'm going to be very honest with you. It was the first time, other than work, I had gone into a public space since March. And this was about, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks ago, because I too was vaccinated in the early cohorts. And as I approached the FedEx gentleman who was wearing appropriate mask, etc., with the appropriate lines on the floor, I literally put the package down and jumped backwards.
Mhm.
And I realized that I was probably infinitely more afraid just to be in that room, but I think I scared the FedEx man. He was afraid, and there he was at work doing his job, which I'm sure he had done from almost the beginning. So, my question for you is, how do we re enter today? What advice and guidance do you have for everyone listening to this Zoom who is afraid to go to FedEx, who's afraid to go to the supermarket, who is afraid to go to the mikvah, who is afraid to do anything that they've done without any thought a year ago? And if you could help me, I would be very grateful, because I know you're going to be helping every single person who's watching this Zoom.
And maybe even myself, because even though I've been a proponent of reentry for a very long time. I've been very concerned that the longer we stayed isolated and the longer we stayed in quarantine, the more we replaced realistic projections with fear. After 9/11, there was a study done, and the highest places of PTSD were among people that were literally at the towers, in New York, and people in the Midwest. Why people in the Midwest? Because people in New York and people were able to know that going outside did not mean that they're going to have towers come burning up. Planes were not flying all the time and hitting other buildings. They knew that they could go to work. They knew that it was safe. They were actually out living life. People in the Midwest did not have that reality construct and context. They had seen the towers. They replayed the towers again and again and again. And without that context, all they had was their fear, anxiety, and terror. So at that point, there were a bunch of people in the Midwest who had PTSD symptoms almost equal to those who had been not in the towers on the day of 9/11, but in the same neighborhood, below 34th Street, below Penn Station, whereby the smoke and the smell was still present. And I think that that's a model and a lesson for all of us, actually. What really happens is that we live in a world where all things are always possible. Everything is always possible. Look at the reality. Look at the story of the J&J vaccine, if I may. There's almost 7 million doses being given, and there were 6+ or maybe 8+ or maybe 10+ people who have had a reaction that was potentially, and at least in 1 or 2 cases, lethal. That's out of 7 million doses. Everything is always possible. It is always possible that that something is going to happen, but that's not the way we live, because we lived in the possible and not in the probable, we would not live. It's safer to stay in your basement. It's safer to stay at home. It's safer to stay under the covers, but that's not life. That's not existence. So what I'm going to say to you is that the other thing that happens is that with the prolonged quarantine and with the uncertainty and with the focus on all the danger, there has not been sufficient attention to the fact that things have changed. Because although there are reinfections, and you're the expert at this, not me, although the vaccine, no vaccine is 100% safe. No immunity is 100% is perfect. Although there are reinfections, there are people whom the vaccine does not take, there are people whom there are all kinds of things that happen. Even those that get COVID again don't seem to have a much milder case. So not only do we have less infection risk, we have dramatically reduced to a minuscule number the risk of serious illness and death. And that has been going on now for a while, and that's gotten lost. which is a reflection of the fact that we're living in that we live now psychologically in the possible as opposed to the probable.
I
We
think
need to
I think my colleagues and I would agree with you that the information, the communication pathway has been radically distorted.
So, but what happened with COVID originally is that actually those things were confused. In COVID, when it first started, it seemed like the improbable became the possible.
Yes, yes, I agree with you.
And that's one of the reasons that we are in this psychological psychiatric mess now, because we've always lived in the probable. You know, you have a car accident, you get back in your car,
Right.
maybe you check your seatbelt a little bit better. Maybe you're a little bit more cautious, but you go back into the car because the chance of you having a serious car accident again are very small. You've traveled hundreds of thousands of miles before your serious car accident, assuming you're not 17 or just got your license. And so the chances of it happening again are very, very small. And so we live in the probable. We don't live in the possible. We live, and that's what we need to reset. We need to reset the reality that going to FedEx is actually safe. Is there a chance that there's going to be some weird things? Probably the chance that you were going to have a car accident, you were going to have a fender bender in Great Neck on the way to FedEx was much greater than the chance of getting sick in FedEx. But you're so used to working in that probability schema that didn't frighten you.
So how do you reorient your thinking? What's your advice to how to begin this process?
It's an intellectual, it's a cognitive, emotional, and pragmatic process. The cognitive process is that we go back to what we normally do in all our lives, throughout our everyday existence. We've always identified risk, assessed risk, mitigated risk, and then incorporated risk and moved on. You know what the risk is if it's, you send your, if you're lucky enough to have children, and you choose to have children, you send your kids out and it's cold. It's cold. You identify the risk, you assess the risk, you make them wear their gloves even if they yell at you. And then you incorporate risk, but you don't keep them inside bundled up. You don't prevent them from going to school. You talked about going to FedEx. I talked about going in the car. The experience of going to the supermarket. For months and months, if the supermarket was crowded, even I was the designated shopper because I'm going to work. If I was in the supermarket was crowded, or that aisle was crowded, I wouldn't go. I'd come home without the eggs. I went and waited 3 hours, waited 45 minutes online to get into the store to get. But there were too many people there and I was too afraid and I left. But the reality is so how do you do this? So there is a cognitive element of really knowing, being able to take a step back and looking what the information actually is. Knowing that our fear there's now an increasing gap between what we're afraid of and what we know. We're supposed to live in what we know and not what we're supposed to use what we know to conquer what we're afraid of. And in COVID, we used what we're afraid of to obscure what we know. So there's a cognitive element. There's also there's a psychological element. Psychological element says that living in what we know and living in our life, that we reset, we say to ourselves, I literally have patients practice that it's possible, but it's not probable. And actually the way it works is because we actually live in probability. You go to school because it's probably you're going to graduate. You go out to work because it's probably going to come home. I can go through all those elements that we do in our everyday, big and little decisions are all based on probability. They're not based on possibility. And the last pragmatic thing is really about practice. You went to FedEx and you survived. You came home and you're okay. And you'll go again and you'll come home and you're okay. I have a patient that has been living in our house for God knows how long. And she went outside. I made her come to see me in person. I've been doing telemedicine. And I made her come see me in person. She said to me she couldn't believe she went outside and the sun was shining. She's a little annoyed the sun was shining because of all those months she lost, but she was also surprised that the sun was shining. So that in actuality, and I'm giving too long an answer to too short a question, but it's really critical. It's really practice here makes perfect. Every time we have to get back our land legs. We have to get back our sense that it's safe, that the world is actually safe, even though we have to be aware that there are risks. COVID still exists. You have to be smart. You have to be attentive, but you can't be in terror and afraid.
I cannot thank you enough, Dr. Hindi Mermelstein, for sharing your thoughts, your insight, your wisdom, your scholarship with us today. I am Dr. Amy Fox, and I am thanking Dr. Hindi Mermelstein for joining us on behalf of Nishmat and the Health and Halacha Conference. Have a safe day.